Dr. Jonette on Grow with Dr. Jonette. I've got a big dish pan full of tomatoes. Today I'm going to show you how to can whole tomatoes, or if you want to cut them into, let's say, quarters, how to can tomatoes. It's a really simple process, and let's get cooking and jump right into canning them. But make sure you watch all the way to the end. As we go along, I'm going to be giving you tips, pointers, techniques, and some of the secrets that I've developed over the years of growing up on a small family farm, canning tomatoes with my 10 siblings, and also over the years of having my own organic garden, canning tomatoes for my kids as they were growing up, now for my grandkids, and for my husband, Farmer Fred, and myself. So what are the supplies you're going to need for canning tomatoes? You're going to need some jars. You may want either pint jars or quart jars. You could go bigger than that, but I like to use quart jars. There's a couple of types of quart jars. One has a narrow mouth and one has a wider mouth. I like the wider mouth, especially when I'm canning whole tomatoes. It makes it much easier to get the tomato in the jar. The other thing you're going to need is you're going to need some lids. Make sure you purchase new lids, and rather than reuse the lids that you've used before. You can purchase I purchase my lids in bulk, so I will purchase several hundred lids at a time. It saves a lot of money. Or if you're only canning a few jars, go ahead and purchase a package of a dozen lids. These are your wide mouth lid jars, your lids for your wide mouth jars. And let me open them up here. You can see what they look like. And these are the lids for your narrow mouth jar that I purchase in bulk. In addition to that, you're going to want jars that have rings on them. I reuse the rings. I don't reuse the lids, but I do reuse the rings. The rings, as you can see, it's a little bit rusty. What I do when I'm done sealing the jar and it's ready to put away for the winter for use later on, I take the rings off of the jar rather than leave them on the jar. You don't need them to leave them on the jar. The lid is tight on there, it's sealed, and you can take the rings off. The other thing I've noticed, by taking the rings off, it helps them last longer, because sometimes there's a little bit of juice from the canner or juice from the canning process that will tend to rust out the lids quicker. So I just take the lids off and reuse them, have them available for next time. The other things you're going to want is you're going to need some sort of canner. This is actually a pressure canner. It has a lid on the top of it that allows me to seal it and then add pressure as I heat up the contents of the canner. The pressure increases and it allows me to pressure can. I also use it as my water bath canner. To water bath, you just need a large kettle that has some sort of something in the bottom that will protect your jars from sitting right on the bottom of the kettle. You don't want your jars to sit on the bottom of the kettle, because the burner, especially if you don't have a core on the bottom of your kettle, like a lot of canner kettles have like a core that protects the jars from the heat of the bottom of the kettle, but not enough that it won't keep your jars from breaking. So this adds a little space between the bottom of the canner and your jar that allows the water in the canner to insulate them just enough that you don't pop the bottom of your jar out of your canning jar. If that happens, it's a mess. Believe me, you don't want that to happen. So otherwise, you are probably going to want something called, I call this a jar lifter. It allows me to put the jar into and then take it out of the hot water when it's done processing. I'll show you all the processes as we go along, but let's go ahead and get our jars filled and get them ready to go into our canner. I'm going to just set the canner to the side here and we'll start filling our jars. I remember when I was a kid growing up, there were 10 kids in our family and we grew up on a small family farm. We all had to participate and were expected to be part of all of the things that we did on the farm to keep the farm growing, as well as to grow and provide food for our large family. We had a huge garden, we had orchards, and we had lots of things to do in the summer. One of them was canning tomatoes. One of my jobs when I was growing up was to put the tomatoes into the jar. And back then we had the narrow mouth jars, which meant when the tomato went in, when I was younger, my hand was small enough. I could then follow the tomato in with my hand and position it in the jar to make sure that the jar didn't have any spaces. Now I use large mouth jars so that I can put the tomatoes in the jar. You can see here there's either I have to squish the tomato down into the jar or I have to cut it. I usually like to cut the tomato. I like to cut the tomato before I put it in the jar. It helps it fit in better. I usually cut the tomatoes in quarters and then I put them in the jar. And about one more is going to go in there. What you want to do is when you're filling that jar, you want the tomatoes to be about an inch from the top of the jar. You can see here that they've filled the jar nicely and they're about an inch from the top of the jar. What you also want to do is wipe off any extra tomato product that might be along the rim of the jar. That'll help your jar seal better before you put your ring. A couple of things about the jar. Number one, make sure it's clean. I run it through the sanitize cycle on my dishwasher to make sure it's clean. And number two, run your finger around the top like this to make sure there's no chips or cracks, because any chips out of the top of the jar will keep it from sealing. The other thing is I used to heat up the lids. Back in the day, the rubber wasn't as good of a quality as what they use on the lids now. And if the rubber on the lid wasn't hot, it wouldn't seal the jar quite as well. I haven't found that to be the case in a number of years actually. And so I no longer heat up the lids. I used to, for two reasons. One is it sterilized them, which you don't really need to do because you're going to be cooking this jar of tomatoes, so it doesn't need to really be sterilized. That will happen when you cook it. But the other was, of course, to heat up the rubber and soften it enough to help the jar seal. You can just put the lid, a nice brand new clean lid right on the jar, put your ring on it and just finger tighten it. It doesn't have to be super tight, just finger tight is great, and it goes right into the canner and gets water bathed. A little bit about whether or not you should water bath or pressure can tomatoes. Tomatoes are a high acid product and for the most part can be water bath. If you just have tomatoes, maybe with a little salt on. That reminds me, what you also want to do is I like to add a little salt to the tomatoes. If you're on a no salt diet or a low salt diet, this is a great way to get tomatoes that are low salt or no salt. I like to use sea salt, a coarse canning type sea salt, and about a teaspoon of sea salt in the top of the tomato jar before you put the lid and the ring on it. But like I said, if you're a no salt or low salt diet, then you can skip the salt and the tomatoes are still delicious. You can always, or if you forget, you can always add it later to the jar. Your jar, this is a delicious jar of tomatoes that is ready to go in the canner. So let's fill up. My canner holds 7 jars. We're going to fill up 7 more jars with tomatoes, and we'll get them in the canner and get them cooking. We have the jars in the canner and it's ready to go on the stove. It goes on the stove. I could put a lid on it, but I don't. It's easier to monitor it and see when it starts to boil. Once it starts to boil, I set a timer for 20 minutes. The timer goes off and my tomatoes are canned. I take them out, let them cool, put the next batch in and process it. And once they're cool, check to make sure that the lids are sealed. And they go downstairs in my pantry area where I keep all of my canned goods. Thank you for watching this video. I hope that you found a lot of helpful information. I also want to encourage you to can your own vegetables, can your own tomatoes, especially any of your high acid vegetables. It's so easy because all you have to do is water bath it. You don't have to worry about pressure canning it. And it is delicious and so much better for you and healthier for you. You also know that there's no herbicides, no pesticides. There's nothing in that jar of tomato product that is going to be harmful to you. When you sign up for notifications, you will know when I post my next video. Also, for full recipes as well as lots more information about canning, lots of recipes of things that you can use your canned goods in, as well as simple as smart ideas and tips for culinary excellence. And I have neuro-nutrition nuggets where I teach you about why foods are good for your brain, why it's important to have your own garden, how that is healthy for your brain. And I also have parenting ideas and tips that I bring in the science of neuroscience to help us understand what is happening in our brain and how we can live a healthier life, have more well-being, be less anxious, and have overall happiness. Your subscription also helps me reach 10,000 more people. My goal is to reach 10,000 more people, get 10,000 more subscriptions by the end of this year. So thank you for subscribing and for telling your friends about this channel. Don't forget, also go to Grow with Dr. Jonette, and we'll see you next time.